Hi, everybody. I'm so glad to have all of you for the next episode of History 102. And we're having a bit of a change where the old host, Eric Torenberg, stepped down, and now we have a new co host, Austin Paget. Austin Paget is a professional libertarian, and I'll leave it at that. Tell people about your background.
Hey, great to meet you. I live in Austin, Texas, where I met Rudyard. I've been a libertarian for a long time, pretty much for my whole life. Um, and I worked in agriculture in Asia for a while, uh, international business, did some ag tech startups, and now I'm getting back more into politics and history.
Yeah. Austin's job for a long time is he would go to rural villages in India and Southeast Asia to help them with agricultural development. So there's an angle there. He's done a lot of libertarian stuff, and so he has a background in politics, agriculture, some stuff, history, anthropology, whatever.
Yep, and I've been on YouTube long enough to come across Rudyard, so now we've become good friends.
Yeah. So let's get into the historic topic. So which is last episode, and I apologize for holding everyone off for so long, is from Eastern Europe in the 17th century to Western Europe in the 17th century. And as you guys can see, I have my 17th century cavalier hat. It was an era of very flamboyant fashion because of the aristocracy. And so guys would wear long flowing robes. They'd carry swords like this. This is my favorite sword. It's a 17th century English backsword. This is a murder sword because you would have aristocratic dueling swords that you would use in case someone insulted your honor fighting in the street. And this is a sword for war. Um, these were very popular in the 17th century. This is a good place to start. It's one of my favorite eras of history, and I find it really fascinating because it exists on the edge of the medieval and the modern. It's in the uncanny valley where if you brought someone from the 1600s on the Zoom call, you could understand them perfectly fine. They would speak in a way that makes sense to you. They would come up, you are culturally closer to an Anglo from the 1600s than you are probably to almost any country in the world today. The cultural difference from an Anglo in the 1600s to a modern American is closer than Chinese, Russian, African, whatever. And an example of the real an example of the real difference between them is in the 1600s there was a very cold period called the mini ice age. And in the mini ice age the temperature dropped, and back in the 1600s they were able to correlate sunspot activity with temperature decline. So they knew even at the time that the temperature was driven off solar flares. At the exact same time, the experts reported witch burnings, where in the Middle Ages, people, and this is a weird mental conflation, people mix up the Middle Ages and the early modern period. In the Middle Ages, people thought that witches weren't real because the Catholic Church told them they didn't exist. In the early modern period, they did. And it was this top down authoritarian measure by the experts to push for witchcraft because they studied the science of that era, that being religious texts, and they came to the conclusion witches were real and they should have the Inquisition. So it's this very weird mix of solar flares, scientific measurement, this is the birth of science, with medieval superstition.
Yeah, it's a really interesting conflating era, kind of physically represented by the pike and shot, which is a
Exactly.
real transition technologically.
Yeah.
Um,
I was going to say that with the sword because in that era you had the pike and shot technique is a combination, and it's this ratio of a certain amount of spears and a certain amount of guns. And so for the battles, and over the 1600s, the ratio of guns to spear, the ratio of guns to pikes radically changed. So at the beginning of the century, and this was a big thing with the 30 Years' War, where Gustavus Adolphus changed from mostly pikemen to mostly guns. And so you see the transition from a melee-based warfare to a range-based warfare.
right. And did the French hold on to cavalry a little bit longer than the rest of them?
I don't know. It wouldn't surprise me. So
Right.
there was a major change in cavalry tactics where uh, knights were not popular. Knights fell out of popularity in the 1400s due to pikemen, and this would belong in a late medieval video. But during the 1400s, European governments would hire armies of mercenaries as pikemen, and the Swiss did that. The Scots did that. Um, there were groups called the Landsknechts in Germany who would do it. It was mercenary bands. And one of the things of the 1600s is all of the military is fought by mercenaries. And this was part of the why the 30 Years' War was so horrifying, because it was people with no ethnic tie to the areas they were fighting in. And so they would just rape and pillage and do all those horrible things. And that was a big reason for professional militaries. But cavalry were really unpopular, and the cavalry you did have were guys who rode up and shot pistols at the pikemen. What Gustavus Adolphus did with the Swedes is he brought shock cavalry back in, because changing pikes for muskets allowed shock cavalry riding up to your enemy and slashing and cutting them. It allowed that to be more militarily effective. And so it's interesting that we think the rise of modernity means more guns, more advancement. But no, over the course of the 1600s, cavalry became actively a more important military arm. And what you might be thinking of is the French had the best cavalry of anyone in Western Europe. That's what they were known for.
Right. Yeah. It's interesting how it goes in waves like that, where
Yeah,
it was on its way
exactly.
to becoming irrelevant in the long run,
Yeah.
but the temporary slowness of the gunpowder opened up a window.
Yeah, in modern warfare we call tanks cavalry. So America still has cavalry regiments. It's just we call the tanks cavalry because they operate in a similar military role to what knights would used to do.
Right. And tanks are the thing that changed World War
Modern
II
warfare, yeah,
into
World War
a
One,
defense, yeah, into a from a defensive war in World War One to
exactly.
an offensive war.
Yeah,
And 1600s were a defensive war era connected to the Star Force and
yes,
the mercenaries, the lack of an
exactly.
ability to get marshal your population to
Agreed.
suicide.
Yeah,
Um,
where and we're going to talk at the 1600s wars, the issue for why it was so difficult to conquer territory. And I'm reading a book. I finished reading a book a month ago, Will Durant's History of the Age of Louis XIV. And one of the very interesting points in that is that Louis XIV was considered to be a great conqueror for conquering Alsace and conquering Franche-Comté. Those two areas are both, that's like Delaware and New Jersey in size. Americans forget how small Europe is, where all of England is the size of Pennsylvania or Michigan, and France is the size of Texas. So Louis XIV was a great conqueror for taking the Alsace and Franche-Comté, which are these kind of unimportant provinces of the Spanish Empire, and the reasoning is because the fortifications were so advanced, where they had the Trace Italienne, which were these huge star forts. And the fort construction, France's greatest genius, Vauban, he was a fort designer. So that's what they were using their human capital for. They had these beautiful, incredibly difficult to take forts. And I was visiting Luxembourg. And Luxembourg was called the Gibraltar of the North. It was the center of the Spanish Empire in the Netherlands. And Luxembourg had four different ranges of walls, and the walls were, I think, four ranges, and they were built into the mountain. So it's this symbiotic, basically fortifying of a mountain outcrop. Luxembourg was how the Spanish were able to hold on to Belgium as part of their empire for centuries against waves of French invaders, because it was impossible to conquer anything due to a combination of the incredible fortifying abilities and also the weakness of the governments. And this is something we forget about because we are in such a strong state society. We forget what a society with a weaker state looks like. And so we assume that in the 1600s, the government was as strong as it is now, but the government couldn't do anything. It was completely weak. It was less than 3% of the total economy of the country. And for today, the government's half of the economy to two-thirds. And
right.
so you have these very weak governments who couldn't muster men, and the people didn't believe in the governments. So it was impossible to conquer anyone because people were really fortified. But with the French Revolution, and there were almost no technological innovations in warfare between the 30 Years' War in the 1600s and the French Revolution around 1800, the French could immediately take the Belgium, Luxembourg, Germany, Italy. They could conquer all of Western Europe because the French Revolution, implicit in it, was a social message that allowed basically mass conscription. So the French could just get these huge armies and then just steamroll these fortifications.
Right. And then you could take the losses,
Exactly.
and you almost need some sort of other domestic internal drivers, I feel like, to get your
Exactly.
population to do that. Some sort of unrest or
Yeah,
lack of other
yeah.
opportunity.
Yeah, this opens up a really brilliant point I was going to forget to talk about, but one of the interesting parables of the 1600s, especially from a libertarian perspective, is it's a completely different the political compass is completely different, where the new progressives were auth-right, because over each century it's a different cultural zeitgeist that washes over whatever is popular in that century. And interestingly, the English speakers tend to be one of the people who are less affected by whatever cultural zeitgeist is big that century. Zeitgeist is the cultural feeling of that moment. It's a German word. And so in the 1600s, the popular cultural current was what Leviathan talks about. And Leviathan is a book by Hobbes. And Leviathan, interestingly, he was an ultra progressive in the cultural context he lived in. But being an ultra progressive, thought we need to have a massive state that controls everything based off divine right and worship of God. So that was what the popular political new consensus was. It was absolute authority. But the interesting thing is the state was so weak beforehand that
Mhm.
absolute authority, like the Spanish or what the French got, was
Right.
still vastly weaker than even democratic governments today. Where we talk about absolutism, but one of the very interesting things, one of the next videos I'm considering covering is the French Revolution. And one of the interesting paradoxes, and keep in mind, the French Revolution is the culmination of the social order that came out of the 1600s. It's the same monarchy, same social structure. Is that the King of France was given absolute authority in order to maintain freedom, which is weird, but that's kind of what the absolutism was. And it's interesting that it's like communism. The countries that took communism in the 20th century were the ones that performed the worst. So not listening to the new cultural zeitgeist was the smart thing to do. It was the same thing in the 1600s, where the countries that followed this current really harshly, like
Mhm.
the Prussians are the ones who worked well, but the people who became the absolute monarchies, Prussia did well, France ultimately weakened itself. Austria ultimately weakened itself. The Spanish ultimately weakened themselves. And for Prussia, it worked because they were basically barbarians. Prussia is this German state in the northeast of Germany, out in the frontier with the Poles and the Balts. And Prussia was so poor and undeveloped that going authoritarianism meant that they didn't have a capitalism to hurt. And so their people stayed vigorous and tough so that they could conquer more wealthy capitalist societies. They were basically doing a Mongol strategy, but it
Interesting.
hurt everyone with more advanced capitalist economies like Austria and Spain and France.
Kind of how if you try and go 50-50, sometimes it's not as effective as
Yeah,
going fully
yeah,
committing to one method.
yeah,
But then the countries that did well in Europe, including England, were the ones
yes,
that found a way to weaken their monarchy somehow,
exactly.
which I guess unraveled the rest of the ossified
Yes,
bureaucracy in
exactly.
the society.
The English and the Dutch did the best in the 1600s, where for for the 1600s, and this is a great transition to actually talk about the 1600s chronologically, because we've been hitting thematic points,
Right.
is the 1600s ultimately is the story of North Europe's victory over South Europe. Because up until that point, if you read Shakespeare plays, Shakespeare, most of his plays are set in Italy, because even in the late 1500s, Italy was the cultural capital of Europe. By the time you get to the end of the 1600s, England had easily surpassed Italy on any given level. And Mediterranean Europe used to be equal, if not wealthier, to North Europe. And then by the end of the 1600s, for reasons we'll explain, namely the rise of absolutism, the English and the Dutch first went ahead, and then they created a ripple effect across the Germans, the Nordics, the French, who created the world that ultimately became the Industrial Revolution.
Right. And how does the economic side tie into the weakening of the monarchy and the religious ideas at the time?
That's a great question. So this reminds me of Francis Fukuyama, who wrote about um, societies need to have a culture and a state, and the power of the culture or the state the predicates the development. He gives India as an example where the culture won, and China as an example where the state won. And the English speakers have done a good job of threading the culture and the state, because the tyranny of culture ends up with theocracies that mandate every single part of your life. You lived in India with custom, and then China. Have you lived in China?
No. Oh yeah,
Okay.
I lived in Hong Kong for half a
Okay,
year.
yeah. So you know both of these. In China, the state has everything, and for the English-speaking countries, they were able to because it's interesting that you have to manage the duality. For example, the normal negative historic tyranny is the alliance of kin, the church, and the nobility. So nobility owns property, owns lands, they oppress the public. The family keeps you in low growth strategies, serving your family, and then the church gives you platitudes as opium for the masses. Leftists are right that this is the normal negative situation societies end up with. What leftists don't understand is that this negative constellation is better than what the left offers. If you're in Tsarist Russia, it's better to take the czars than the communists, because we've seen both examples with the exact same people. And you can warp that, though, for better, where if the family, the religion, and the state work together, um, and act as mutually competitive forces, you have a free society, which is what the West European and the Anglo-Saxon Revolution was.
Right. And if you don't invent yourself in a different positive way, then
Yes.
resisting the current progressive trend is like saying the czar is better is like saying when you're hanging off a cliff and you're like
Yeah.
holding on would be better than letting go.
Yes, exactly.
But without some sort of counter option, um, you're you're going down.
Exactly. Let me get into the chronological, because for the History 102s, we often talk about the thematic details and the chronological. And they're both very important, and most history people just look at the chronological, but that strips the history of any vitality. And so the 1600s were coming out of the 1500s, and the 1500s are a historic golden age. And people mostly only think about the 1500s through Shakespeare because he's one of the few thinkers we have. But it was called Merry England, and England is a good example and a good encapsulation of this because it was the Elizabethan Golden Age. It was written about for centuries after a time when rule was fair, when the world was at peace, when people were growing wealthier. Fernand Braudel, in his 2 volume history, Fernand Braudel was kind of a Chad. He wrote a 2,000 volume history of late 1500s Mediterranean culture, which was a major breakthrough in the fields of economics and history while in a Nazi concentration camp. He wrote the chapters in his head while he was in a work camp.
Wow.
And yeah, pretty based. And so he said that his thesis of the late 1500s was that it was a golden age. And he said the biggest trend you see everywhere was population growth. And he said the population growth was the ultimate trend of the 1500s. And so this links back to the secular cycle, which is something Austin and I have talked about ad nauseum, IRL, because we're waiting for our own secular cycle. And for those that don't know, the secular cycle is a historic trend where, and these happen every 250 years roughly, where an ecosystem gets overpopulated. Once it gets overpopulated, the value of labor goes down, which rises inequality. Basically, labor in human life are commodities like anything else. Once you get too much oil, the price of oil goes down. It's the same thing with human life, although we don't like to think that. And so as overpopulation kicked in, the incentive structures changed where you went to a society where everyone was dirt poor, massive inequality, and then you have political polarization. It's exactly the same thing happening to us now, which is part of the reason why the 1600s is one of my favorite historic time periods, because you can draw an enormous amount of parallels between then and now. For as of now, the political difference is right versus left. But in Western Europe, in the 1600s, it was Protestants versus Catholics. And the two videos I'm considering making next, Austin, are French Revolution and Reformation. Tell me which one you want more.
Uh, I would say the Reformation.
Okay.
Probably, yeah.
Yeah, that fits in well because it ties back to what we're talking about today. So
And it
next,
ties more to the US, where the French
exactly.
is like, we all know the
Yeah,
French
yeah.
Revolution.
Most people don't actually, or they know it
That's
very
true.
rarely. So next video is going to be Protestant Reformation. So you guys will, you'll hear that, and you guys can jump back chronologically to hear about it. But Protestant Reformation, it started it's similar to the right versus the left, where the right versus the left is rehashing 200-year-old political battles today. By the time you get to the 30 Years' War in the 1650s, over a century had passed since Martin Luther had split the Catholic Church, where beforehand the Catholic Church had all of Western Europe. Then the Germanic regions. The best way to predict the Protestant Reformation is ethnically Germanic areas went Protestant and everyone else went Catholic except the Habsburgs. And I'll put a map of Europe up before during the Protestant Reformation because the borders we see now were way more murky and they cut across social class. So Germanic and high agency people were pushed towards Protestantism, and more communitarian, less lower agency people were more likely to be Catholic. And so north of Germany, or all of Germany, was Protestant, and then the Habsburg Empire, based out of Vienna, they were actively fighting against Protestantism, and so Austria, Czechia, Hungary were all majority Protestant. Most of Germany was Protestant. The Catholics held on in France. France was in the weird situation where it was a Catholic majority, but the Protestants fought harder. So the Protestants were
Mhm.
able to get legal. France was this weird joint Protestant Catholic governance situation. We'll have to explain that in the Reformation video, where they held on to power mutually, and then they didn't persecute each other, but they hated each other. Spain and Italy were hyper Catholic. England was the most important Protestant country. The Netherlands was in rebellion. The Netherlands was a former Spanish possession that rebelled against the Spanish, and
Right.
then became an independent republic. And then Scotland was. We're getting way too much in the Protestantism video, but Scotland was Protestant with a Catholic minority, etc. And Europe was divided, and the thing with this is that as of now, if your last name is Ruggieri today, you're going to be a Catholic. If your last name is Livingston, you're going to be Protestant. For the Protestant Catholic line has calcified on ethnic lines, where almost all English Americans are Protestant, almost all Irish Americans are Catholic. And that wasn't the case back then. If you were to go to a country like France or England, because we don't actually take religion that seriously as a society anymore, it's more
Mhm.
so, it's nice to have community and it's nice to have a place for the kids to go, and I feel spiritual ease. Then people argued over obsessive levels of theology because it was the thing that really mattered to them. And the thing we forget when you look at them is we think, oh, they're so silly fighting over religion. Religion is to them what politics is to us. And the way religion worked is that it had manifestations in people's daily lives because the religion, rather than politics, was the thing that determined just the daily things in your life. And so people had direct financial and social self-interest in Protestants versus Catholics. And it was a line that many places cut across cousins, cut across brother and sister, across friends in the same town. And it's like today, where for politics, as an example, the higher your social class is, the higher you care about political outcomes. Where in most societies, the lower classes are kind of just disaffected. And people say if America has a civil war, that most people don't care and they would just want to keep eating Cheetos and playing with their kids and watching TV. I think the political religious corollary is very close between our society and theirs. If you map our society's politics onto their society, it fits with hardcore Protestants, hardcore Catholics, moderates, lots of disaffecteds.
Right. And like you said, it ended up in a period of brutal fighting,
Yeah.
and afterwards, people kind of realized that it was unnecessary. It was silly.
Yes.
Like 30% of the population of
Yeah.
Germany was
Yeah.
killed in the 30-year war.
Yeah. We have
So
to.
is there a way we can avoid? Can we just do a meme war this time? And get it out that way and lose population through lower birth rates, or are we going to have to do it the hard way?
Let's not go through my main content now.
Okay,
I don't want to get into the rest of the WIA stuff because that's what I always talk about. And
good point.
I mean, we all know my answer. I think a lot of people are going to die in our society. Um,
Right.
um,
Okay. Me more. Back to the 1600s.
no, I think people are going to die. I think there's going to be blood on the streets. I think several major cities will get burned down. I think there'll be mass famine in the second, the third world.
Yep. It definitely depends on how successful we are with a few things.
Yes.
Speaking of what are some lessons we can draw from the 1600s? So basically, it was Spain was powerful. They
Yes.
were
Yes.
conquering the Netherlands. They eventually got pushed out.
Yes.
France and England teamed up minorly
Yes.
on the Netherlands, and then that kind of failed.
Yes.
And
Let's
then
go.
England, yeah,
Let's
go
explain
ahead.
the events. So, I think we should make videos of the 30 Years' War and the English Civil War by themselves. So I'm
Right.
going to cover them in a cursory detail. This is supposed to be a video where, let's say, we can cover them in abstract and then we can have extra videos talking about them more in depth. And so, said secular cycle cracked across Europe. And interestingly, France and Russia both have secular cycles consistently 50 years for the rest of Europe. I'm not sure why. And so France and Russia actually gained positional advantages because they had had their social crises earlier vis-a-vis the rest of Europe so that they could attack the rest of Europe when they were weak because they had already gone through their previous crises. And so the crisis of the 17th century started with the 30 Years' War. And in the 30 Years' War, I need to backpedal where this is a world where Spain is the greatest power in the world. And the Spanish Empire, and watch our Spanish Empire video, it had covered every single continent. The Spanish had all of Latin America, and Spain was in a joint monarchy with both Burgundy, Austria, Burgundy, and Portugal. So the Spanish had all of Mexico, they had the Caribbean, they had all of South America, including Brazil. They had a couple places like Angola or Mozambique. They had colonies in the Indian Ocean like Goa and modern Singapore and the Philippines. They had colonies in the Solomon Islands and they had boats in Antarctica. So you could literally claim the Spanish had colonies in every single country of the world, every single continent in the world. And the Spanish government is a wonderful lesson on what not to do. And I had an existential crisis where I have two friends who worked at the Fed, and I asked them, "Does anyone at the Fed know about 17th century Spain economics?" And they said no. And that made me want to die because if we taught Imperial Spain as a guide to what not to do, it would be a pretty good guide. Where in Imperial Spain, they had hyperinflation of the currency. They established a monopolistic economic system where only the buddies of the king could have deals. And the biggest issue of 1600s economics was monopolism. Where in England, or the English Civil War, they would say, my shoes are Monopoly, my soap is from Monopoly, my hair gel's from Monopoly. Every single part of West Europe's economy before this crisis was monopolized. And the
Would
success.
Yeah, would people complain about it? Would the citizens complain about monopoly, like you just said? Was it one of the complaints in the English
Oh,
Revolution,
that was
or
you could the most seminal issue of the English Civil War was probably monopolism because
interesting? So it was on people's minds. They were
yeah,
aware that they were
exactly.
being controlled by these,
Yes,
unlike
yes.
today, where we're kind of not even aware that we have a guild system through the
Yes.
regulatory bureaucracy.
Something to
Back
keep
then,
in
they
mind.
knew.
Something to keep in mind is that the crisis of the 1600s was in a lot of ways high agency people versus low agency people. And so inside Europe, you had the Protestants being the radical Protestants were the high agency faction, and the Catholics were the low agency faction. And that makes sense considering their religion, where Protestantism is a religion based on making your own choice, and Catholicism is a
Mm.
religion based around following the church's ideas. And so the English Civil War, it was a conflict between. Let me go through each of these crises and say what subgroup they're based out of. English Civil War was the capitalists in the east of England. They were people who populated modern New England. Um, they were anti-monopoly because they were the free market people who would crush the monopolies. The king was based out of southwest England. These people populated the American South with the landowners. So the king was maintaining control of the economy through giving monopolies to his buddies and trying to stop the free market actively. In France, their civil war was again the Protestant merchants and nobility who supported the parliament. In England, the capitalists always supported the parliament in the 1600s, and your success in the 1600s was predicated upon how much the capitalists won vis-a-vis the old nobility. And actually, in France, it was the nobility working with the parliament and the merchants against the king, and the king was using the bureaucracy as a wedge against both the nobility and the merchants. So France, Protestants against monopolism, and France had 4 times England's population, but the English were able to outcompete the French in the next century because the English got rid of monopolism with the English Civil War, while the French doubled down on it. And that's a big reason why France never realized its potential. Where for the Spanish, the monopolists totally won because they had no Protestants. And the death of Mediterranean Europe was due to because the authoritarians allied with the monopolists and the Catholics, and then the Protestants allied with the Protestants allied with the merchant class. And so with the end of this crisis, you saw the south of Europe fall to autocracy and monopolism and absolutism. And it's very comparable to modern Latin America because Latin America stems from the Bourbon monarchy system, where France and Spain were all part of the same monarchy. And the Bourbons established like bourbon whiskey because Louisville was a French colony. The bourbon whiskey, it stems from, sorry, not bourbon whiskey, the Bourbon monarchy. They made all these monopolistic deals, and that's how Latin America is today. Go to Colombia, the government has deals, they pay off certain factions, they have monopolies, they use regulations. They were using regulations in the 1600s to give certain stuff to monopolistic buddies even back then.
Right, and they used the many same excuses to uphold the guild monopoly. So you had
Exactly.
regional guilds that were standardized and
Yes.
controlled through the monarchy.
Yes.
And they would say that these were necessary for maintaining high quality,
Yes.
maintaining high exports for standardization, which is a really funny one because we know as soon as the Dutch kind of busted down their
Yes.
guilds, which was after they weakened the monarchy, which
Yes.
probably was a result of them having foreign monarchs for so long. That
Yes.
probably helped them push it off early.
Exactly.
But then you'd start develop modern supply chains,
Yes.
modern industrial uh, processes. Yeah, so they
Yeah.
could build ships 10 times as fast. Their
Yes.
textiles were way more standardized, way higher quality. And so France's oligarchy started to just bleed money because
Yes.
they were losing, instead of a competing cartel of a few monarchies, they were starting to get destroyed by these guys who left the cartel. At
Yes.
that point, you they concluded that the only option was to go to war, being unwilling
Yes.
to give up their monopoly, and eventually they had to give it up because the Dutch
Yes.
were making ships 10 times as fast. And it's kind of like the automated ports, right? In China, you have automated
Yeah.
ports. We have our unions of dock workers, and we don't want to automate our ports. Uh,
Yes.
and that puts you at a huge disadvantage militarily
Yes.
with that, yeah, technology.
This breakthrough we're describing is possibly the most important breakthrough in written history, where the English and the Dutch made it in the late 1600s, and it was both due to the merchant class winning and establishing parliaments, because merchant classes naturally push for parliaments because they believe in property rights and stable power and low taxes. And in the English Civil War, the parliamentarian Puritans beat, and both of them were Calvinists. There's a theory Calvinism is instrumental in the creation of modern capitalism, and that makes sense to me. And the so Puritans, they establish England's property rights because the King of England, the more I talk, the more I realize we really need a 30 Years' War and an English Civil War video because there's
Right.
so much meat here. Where the English parliamentarians, they seized power. And then the Dutch, they kicked the Spanish out in 1648, finally. Then each of them, you saw 4 different revolutions that ultimately changed the world. The first was the scientific revolution. We'll probably need to make an invention of science video for its own sake because it's different track. But science really came out in the 1600s, where all the most important scientists we think of, like Francis Bacon was the guy who made the first philosophy of science. He presaged this in the late 1500s. But you have Leibniz, you have Kepler, you have Isaac Newton, who lived in the 1600s. You have Galileo. So the breakthrough to modern science occurred in the 1600s, where in the 1500s, the Renaissance had no science. And when we make the science video, it's interesting that these 1600s authors, it's this combination of religion and mysticism and science that we don't have. So Isaac Newton was obsessed with the occult, and the principles of science came from studying Hermeticism. And so if you read from the 1600s, they used the scientific method on angels and demons, and they used the scientific method on spiritual development. So John Dee, who was a big, one of England's most important thinker in the Elizabethan era, he established a scientific switchboard of mysticism to attain God, and he wrote down a scientific language on how to consult with demons. So
Would
very
this be
cool
kind of
stuff.
like would this be kind of like today, people doing studies around DMT, spirit
Yeah,
world,
like
or
that. Yeah.
psychic projection,
Yes,
or
yes, that exact same stuff. So that's the scientific breakthrough was concentrated across the whole northwest of Europe, but England and Netherlands are the most predominant places. Secondly, is the agricultural revolution, and everyone forgets the agricultural revolution because in the aftermath of the political crisis, England and the Netherlands they made a breakthrough in stuff like fertilizer. You would know about this. You have a background in agriculture, fertilizer, animal husbandry,
seeds.
and seeds, etc. And that resulted in them doubling their quality of life. And so England and the Netherlands, they didn't, for example, Germany lost a third of its population, Spain lost a third of its population, England and France lost hundreds of thousands of people, but they then had the agricultural revolution, which resulted in them naturally doubling their quality of life. Because back then, food was such an important part of someone's income.
Right.
And so that meant England and the Netherlands set themselves up for the Industrial Revolution. The Agricultural Revolution, one of the most important innovations ever, no one knows about it. England and France, quality of life went up. That meant that people were richer to buy products, meant that people could move to the cities because they were freeing up space and freeing up hands. And so England and France industrialized. Well, in France, for example, the French had the state controlled their agricultural system. And that was the thing that blew my mind, that the French government would tell farmers how to farm. And the French had to introduce the potato by trick because the French peasants didn't trust anything the government said. So the way the French government introduced the potato to peasants was by having guards protect it. And then because they didn't trust anything the French
Oh,
government
right,
said,
right.
they'd have guards protect the potato to make it look as if it's valuable. The peasants would steal it and start growing it because the peasants were distrusted the government so much that France and the rest of Europe never had the agricultural revolution, and
Right.
instead you had instead their populations went up, and then they had the period of revolutions with the Napoleonic Wars and the French Revolution. So you have scientific revolution, you have agricultural revolution, you have the breakdown. England at the end of in the 1600s in the Netherlands, they got rid of titles of nobility, so they became the first modern societies. Because a modern society and a social structure is one where the nobility don't have different. Everyone is legally the same. So the breakthrough at the end of the English Civil War allowed property rights to form, and property rights is what allowed the industrial breakthrough. So the first steps of the industrial revolution were occurring in the 1600s as because the all of the faculties where they actually invented the machine gun in the 1600s. As a great example of this, a French mechanic made a machine gun and then he showed it to him. He showed it to the king and the king said, "I'll pay you a tremendous amount to never use this because this is evil."
Wow.
And
Like a samurai reaction almost.
exactly, yes. Um, and and so this is a very intelligent
Um,
society, and one of the most interesting books I've read is it's a sci-fi book, 1632, where a town in West Virginia goes back to the middle of the 30 Years' War, and then they start a bunch of wars to liberate Europe. And the interesting thing is you can tell the people in the 1600s weren't stupid. The scientists in Europe start immediately reverse engineering modern technology, and they can figure it out really quickly because all of the mental concepts we have, like the scientific method,
Hmm.
like our concepts of physics, our concepts of um, basically the toolkit we use for every single part of analysis, most of it existed already in the 1600s.
Right. I think they would not only be able to make sense of our era, but be able to point out and make sense of it in a way that we couldn't. They would be
Right.
able to explain, hey, this is what's
Yes,
going on here. This is just like what happened.
exactly. Yeah, they could understand us better than we understand them.
Hey,
Or
did you
like
know taking on debt was bad? Like,
exactly. Yeah, that was the
yeah.
Puritan Revolution too, they will talk about this in the Protestant Reformation, but there was a huge social. The early modern period was more conservative than the Middle Ages, and the average peasant was better off in the Middle Ages than the early modern period. So stuff like sex, for example, got attitudes towards sex crystallized a lot in the early modern period. But the Puritan work ethic is a good example of this, where Max Weber, his argument is that modern capitalism, and you look at the 1600s, there was rising social conservatism in both Catholic and in Protestant Europe, but the crystallization of the Protestant ethic allowed North Europe to go on its crazy adventures where the obsession with stuff like moral purity, with telling the truth, fair dealing, sexual propriety, saving money that the Puritans had. The Puritans, because I view history as a living phenomena, and so the Puritans built up all of this moral trust that could be spent in the Industrial Revolution. And as of now, we're finally burning up the moral character the 1600s built up. Because you look at it where 1600s religious fundamentalism in the northwest of Europe, 1700s, and the scientific method was very much predicated upon a culture of obsession over truth telling that existed in the religion of the 1600s. So in the 1600s, to speak to another gentleman, to lie to him in any way, was morally completely unpermissible. And and so that allowed a tremendous amount of trust in each other's narratives that everyone else is doing the right thing. So that allowed the Enlightenment. And then with the Enlightenment, it furthermore allowed the era of mass mobilization and romanticism and all of this. The entire Western tradition since is predicated upon a social trust or the Industrial Revolution with the social trust. Basically, the social trust radical Protestants made in the 1600s allowed the entire rest of modernity to happen. Because keep in mind, if England doesn't make this breakthrough then, no industrialization. And keep in mind, industrialization has failed to happen multiple times in history.
Right, right. And you need the whole supply chain around it. Like the
Yeah,
Romans had some designs, but they didn't have the metallurgy or the
exactly.
energy, or yeah, it would be
It's
too
funny.
costly.
We're 45 minutes in, and I haven't actually covered the political stuff, but we're going to have a 30 Years' War video. We're going to have an English Civil War video. But to make a brief summary, because we've already covered all the other background stuff, so we can just do the politics, where the start of the crisis of the 1600s was with the start of the 30 Years' War in 1618, where Habsburg Empire with the Holy Roman Empire. And interestingly, the American Republic is based off the Holy Roman Empire. We were building our constitution off theirs. And so, federated state, completely disunified. The 1600s is an interesting period where Germany is disunified and it's a chessboard, while Sweden and the Turks and Poland are the great powers. And so, ironically, Germany was a parliamentary system where you had several electors or noblemen who would elect the emperor. And all of Europe had parliaments in the Middle Ages, and France and Spain and Italy France, Spain, Italy trashed their parliaments in the 1600s, which we'll get to. And so what happened is that modern Czechia, which was one of the wealthiest parts of the Holy Roman Empire, that region, they were going to switch from a Catholic to a Protestant ruling family. And those Protestants, I'm going to get into this more in the 30 Years' War video. Then that triggered the Habsburgs because if Czechia flipped to Protestant, the Holy Roman Emperor would be a Protestant. And most of Germany, where even Austria, where the Habsburgs were based out of, was Protestant or had a lot of Protestant influence. And the Habsburgs were desperately trying to push down Protestantism in Central Europe because their right to rule, the Holy Roman Emperor, stemmed from the Pope, who gave him the title. Remove the Pope, remove Holy Roman Emperor. And so the Habsburgs then attacked Prague and attacked Czechia so that they would hold on to the electorate. And the Habsburgs were able to control Central Europe, and the Habsburgs, they were this. I can't get into too much detail with the Habsburgs here, but they're this conservative state. I don't think they were the bad guys. They were super conservative, and their whole thing is, what do we need Catholicism to unify our multi-ethnic empire? And so they really cracked down on Central Europe, where after the Habsburgs conquered Czechia, Czechia became from one of the wealthiest places in Europe to one of the poorer parts of the Habsburg Empire. They also cracked down in Austria. They got rid of Protestantism in Hungary. But then the Danes, and the Danes had Norway and Iceland and Greenland, they declared war on the Habsburgs in order to protect the Czechs. And so under the leader Wallenstein, the Habsburgs smashed across North Germany. They got to Denmark, and then they forced the Danes to capitulate as they hid on their island, in the island of Sjælland, versus they took the whole mainland. France paid Sweden to attack Central Europe because France, although it was a Catholic country, it was against the Catholic Habsburgs because the Habsburgs were too close to winning. And so Sweden, under Gustavus Adolphus, he launched an attack on Central Europe. He wiped out the imperial armies, and Sweden was Protestant, massively underpopulated. He was able to wipe out several Habsburg armies outnumbered, and then he died, and then the war stagnated. So the 30 Years' War has all these different players, and then you also have the Spanish fighting against the Dutch, because the Spanish had Belgium, which is ethnically Dutch and French, as their colony, while the Protestants were fighting for independence. And then France entered the war because they were scared the Habsburgs were going to win. In the 30 Years' War, it ended in 1648. It's one of the few wars where if it says 30 years, it's actually 30 years. Most of the time when they say the 30 Years' War, it's like 35. But literally 30 years. And then out of the 30 Years' War, and this is my 5-minute summary because we're going to make a later video once I've read. I have 2 books to read at the 30 Years' War first. I'm not going to read the really big one. I'll read the other 2. And so out of it came the Enlightenment, because the 30 Years' War killed a third of Central Europe's population. In the part of Germany my ancestors are from, Swabia, it killed 3/4, which is why the Swabians are massively overrepresented in the settlement of America. Mm-hmm. And they were just trying to get out. And so after the 30 Years' War, and there's a couple different angles to this conflict to cover, Europe said, we don't want to fight over religion anymore because this was so horrible. And that was the attitude, and was what resulted in the Enlightenment. And the Enlightenment started in the second half of the 1600s. We think of the Enlightenment as an 18th century thing, but you can see this transfer happen in real time. By the time you're in 1660, everyone's like, we're tired of killing each other over religion. And so the Enlightenment and rationality, and we're still writing off the rationalistic sentiment from the 30 Years' War, where our society's idea, let's not kill each other over religion, that's how scarring the 30 Years' War was. But one of the very interesting factors here is that one of the most important parts of the 30 Years' War is that it resulted in these ripple effects of wars across Europe. Because the way the 30 Years' War worked was that it was so scarring. All the countries were really weak and they were all desperate. So as they fought external countries, they had to fight their own wars as well. So England, France, and Spain and Italy all had wars that having to deal with having to fight the 30 Years' War. So France as an example, and I'm going to talk more about France because I don't think we'll make a Louis the 14th video, but France had this detente between Protestant the Protestant nobility, and we'll talk about this in the Reformation video, Protestant nobility had gotten their leader in charge, and the Catholics agreed that that was fine if he converted to Catholicism. So France had this weird deal, and the nobility was very strong in France before. But what happened when young Louis XIV seized the throne is that the parliament and the king fought because the king wanted their taxes. And so France had the second civil war, and then France's civil war was very similar to the English civil war, where Protestant parliament merchants fighting against the centralized king. But what happened is, unlike the English Civil War, the king won. And France had one of the wiliest rulers, one of the wiliest viziers who ran it, which is Cardinal de Richelieu. And he was a genius at managing this stuff. And so in France, the forces of autocracy crushed the parliament. And if the opposite had happened, France would be England. If France had Protestant ruling class, if it had parliament, if it had capitalism, if it got rid of monopolies, France would be industrialized. It would just be England. And also, Spain fell into civil war to fight off the 30 Years' War because the Spanish had to rape their taxpayers. And so a third of Spain died, with the Catalans rebelling, with the Portuguese rebelling, which worked, with famines, with wars. Well, the Spanish had to hold on to Italy because Italy was their colony, and the Italians in Naples started rebelling. So Europe was going up in flames, and England fell in the Civil War. England did a little bit of intervening in the 30 Years' War, not a lot. But then, due to those religious struggles, England in turn fell in the Civil War, where the Parliament killed the king. And then they eventually reinstalled the king because the military dictator who took power afterwards, he wasn't able to solidify power. And so it was this period of massive convulsion across Europe that just rippled across and created different social structures in every single European country.
So this is, based in Protestant
Yeah.
versus Catholic, but we know there's a lot of different types of Protestants at this
Yes.
point. Were the Catholics more kind of less factional, more unified, and then the right
Yes.
had multiple factions like today? And, I mean, the Protestants had multiple
Yes.
factions
Yes.
like the right today, and how did they manage that?
So for the Catholics, you had the Spanish were the big Catholic empire, and the Pope was a Spanish puppet. And so this Pope actually didn't approve of the Spanish Inquisition. He thought it was too authoritarian, but he couldn't say anything because he was in their pocket. Or he did say stuff. He said, Spain, chill the hell out. And the Spanish said no. But the French, they were ultramontanists. And what that means is they were Catholic, but they didn't listen to the Pope that much. And so France's agnosticism, because France was the first country in the world to become agnostic in the modern world, stemmed from their ultramontanism of, we don't want to listen to the Pope because France is great enough that we can do our thing. So they were Catholics, but they were kind of doing their own thing. And France and Spain were the great rivals. And the 1600s is the story of the decline of Spain and the rise of France, because Spain over this period went from the world's greatest power to a complete shell of a country by 1700. By 1700, they're literally dismembering the Spanish Empire. The neighboring countries, Austria, England, Dutch, French, were dismembering the Spanish Empire like a corpse. And then France rose, which is Louis XIV's golden age. Meanwhile, the Protestants, whenever the Catholics were around, they'd find ways to work together. But I read a history of the Reformation, which said the differences between Calvin and Luther were not important in the beginning, but then their egos demanded they have different factions. That's literally what the most preeminent historian of Protestantism, Alec Reary, said. And
Hmm.
so you can split the Protestants in two categories, really, or three. You have the Presbyterians or the Calvinists, Anglicans, Lutherans. So this dovetails into the Protestantism video really well, so I'm not going to get into that now. But in England, as an example, the entire British ecosystem was Protestants. And it was fought between the Anglicans and the Presbyterians. And because Presbyterian and Calvinist, I'm using them synonymously. So English Civil War was really a
Right.
Calvinist versus an Anglican war past the first few years.
Anglican almost being like Catholic.
Yeah,
It
the
slots in.
Anglicans are Anglicans are Catholic right, they're philosophically really Catholic, except for studying the Bible yourself.
And they were
And
defending the monarchy.
exactly, yes, because in England, the king runs the church. And so the Protestants thought, sorry, the Calvinists thought that the Anglicans weren't real Protestants. Same thing with the Lutherans. The Lutherans are also right-wise pretty close to the Catholics with a couple changes. But for both the Anglicans and the Lutherans, they validated reading the Bible and having your own interpretations, which is why if you look at pre-industrial Europe, the English in 1800, the English had three-quarters literacy, and France had 20% literacy. It's why
Wow.
America had 100% literacy among whites in the colonial period. And
Right. Everyone
so,
from East Anglia. Yeah.
yeah, yeah, there are differences, but in the 30 Years' War, as an example, because the Calvinism maps onto modern leftism really well. So east of England was Calvinist, Scotland was Calvinist, the Netherlands was Calvinist, parts of the Rhineland were Calvinist. The ruling family of Prussia were Calvinists, even if their subjects were Lutherans. And so the Calvinists and the Lutherans, when the Catholics were fighting them, they'd work together. The Dutch worked with the other Protestants really well. Um, and also, these distinctions were blurry in the beginning. So in the 1500s, Anglicanism was theologically the same as Calvinism, and then they differentiated,
Right.
and so there wasn't a religious line between the Puritans and the Anglicans in the beginning, and then the line started to form as the Presbyterians had to go more as the Presbyterians went more extreme, and as the Anglicans had to co-opt because over the course of I was gonna call her Lizzie one, but that's disrespectful. Elizabeth the First. Over the reign of Elizabeth the First, Protestants went from 20% of England's population to almost to 90%. And the way they did that was by implementing an Anglican they took Catholic rites and then named them Anglican. So the population went, cool, we're Protestant now. That means nothing for my daily life.
Mm,
Yeah. And so this is dovetailing really well into the Protestant Reformation next week. I'm glad about that. Thank you.
right.
And I have one final point where one of the very interesting things to look at is Louis XIV's reign. And Louis XIV, he's an interesting microcosm because he is seen as one of the greatest leaders in French history, but I'm not actually that impressed by him. And I think he's a below average ruler. And the reason, and you can study Louis XIV's reign through state centralization, where he he took over France in the anarchy, and he had an obsession. I don't not an obsession, it's an accurate strategic calculation. He calculated France needed to weaken the nobility in order to centralize. And so Louis XIV was the guy who
Right. Right.
really got France to centralize. Because keep in mind, France was such a diverse country. The south of France and the north of France were
Mhm.
literally different ethnicities. Even areas next to Paris, like Normandy or Picardy, were completely incomprehensible dialect wise.
Yeah, I grew up in the south of France for a few years and I
Yeah,
adopted a little bit of the accent. I was in Paris later in
yeah,
college for a semester and taking a language class,
yeah,
and the teacher refused to say when I was getting the accent wrong because I was doing provincial or
yeah.
American, because she was just totally on Parisian.
Yeah,
And
that's
there's
such
a
a good
big
symbol.
Norman
Yeah,
language context, conquest inferiority
yeah,
thing
yeah.
going on.
That's such a good example of it. And I used to live in France. I can hear the accent difference. And north of France is such a clearer accent. When
Well,
I
some
when
would say clear, better. I don't know if it's better, but
so I'm not going to say one's better than the other. It's easier to hear as an Anglo, which I guess is
right.
because it's
But
closer.
what Louis did was he was correct, and his
Yes.
move kept the system going for another 150
Yeah,
years,
exactly.
culminating in an even more stagnation and violent
Yes.
collapse at the end.
Exactly.
So
So
sometimes winning is losing. Sometimes,
yes. Very well put. Where he and I'm going to use a couple different examples where he had a genius called Vauban, and Vauban was a mathematician who also built the Fort network. And so, for example, Vauban told Louis XIV, if we send 10,000 people a year to America, which was far less than what Britain was doing, Quebec will have 200 million people in the year 2000. And that turned out to be completely accurate, where about a million Brits came over in the colonial period, and they have 100 million descendants today. Um,
right? They had a really high historical birth
exactly.
rate.
Yeah. And Vauban also pushed for the agricultural revolution inside France. And Louis XIV, again, he is the conqueror of Alsace and Franche-Comté from the Spanish in the Thirty Years' War. That was his big accomplishment, rather than industrializing France, rather than having the colonies in America. And Louis XIV also kicked out all the Protestants out of France, which was a really bad move because the Protestants were the wealthiest, highest agency, most intelligent people. So they moved to England and established the English silk trade. They moved to Barbados and helped establish the sugar in Barbados. A lot of the oldest families of the American South are French Huguenots. And so
Mm,
through expelling the Huguenots, it was this state centralization of France at the expense of the culture. And Louis XIV is known for being one of the cultural high points of the world. And I give him credit for that, where French food was made nearly scientifically in the late 1600s. And so they would pay chefs just to make stuff up, which is something I'd love to do. So modern cuisine of appetizer, main course, dessert, that's a French invention. So many of the kinds of foods we make. And it was France at the end of the 1600s. It was the wealthiest country in the world. Or sorry, it's the wealthiest country in Europe. It was the wealthiest total, although not per capita, country in Europe. It was the height of culture. Uh, People around Europe would Russian nobility would speak French, not Russian, because France was such a
right.
cultural paragon. And so
The
that's where I'll
Greece
end.
thing, yeah.
Where the 1600s ends in this rationalistic world where France is dominant, where the Spanish have gone into decline, yet the English and the Dutch are cooking up their future changes to the total world ecosystem.
Yes, and relating briefly to U.S. politics, you have all the different factions of Protestants. You said they
Yeah,
worked
yeah,
together okay in opposition to the Catholics, and then differentiated once they were successful and able to kind of go their own way. So if you had a weakening of the central structure, and
yeah,
then you had more states operating slightly independently on various metrics,
yeah, yeah.
then you would see the separation of those kind of new factions on the right.
Yes, yes.
Um,
Um, Yeah, I agree with that. So that leads into the Protestant Reformation video, which is next week. Let me drop some book recommendations. So the best book on this topic is The Global Crisis by Jeffrey Parker, that covered the crisis of the 1600s. And that book, read the abridged version. It's way better. Um, then Will Durant has two books in the 1600s. He has The Age of Faith begin. He has The Age of Reason begins. That's the first half of the 1600s. The Age of Louis XIV, second half. Will Durant is really good if you skip his sections on philosophy and art, because he'll spend like 20 pages on France's entire social structure, then he'll drop 50 pages in the life of Erasmus. And I don't care, I'm sorry, I don't care about Erasmus enough to read 50 to 100, no, it's sorry, over 100 pages on Erasmus. And the military revolution by, what's his name, that fellow, Jeffrey Parker as well. That's also really good for the 1600s.
nice. I also found it was interesting how you mentioned agriculture, because
Yeah.
in the history books you're reading, it talks about how agriculture was always the precursor to the Industrial
Yes.
Revolution. And if you go to developing countries, that's what we would say in our company.
Yeah.
Um, you need to develop agriculture to have the savings for people to be able to move into the urban
Exactly.
environment in a way that is connected to skills rather
Agreed.
than just
Yes.
yeah,
Okay. Sounds good.
interesting parallels.
Thank you for coming here at Austin.
Absolutely.
Peace. Bye.
Pleasure.
How do I? Okay, here's the recording.